to my great amusement, it seems to happen with every record we have ever done. Somebody says, "Oh, it's their most accessible record," which sort of implies to a lot of people our records must therefore be inaccessible. So, I mean, this record certainly every track on it is a song, maybe except the last one, and which is it's still a song, but
Right.
the arrangement is a little bit more abstract probably, but almost every single track is set up in the very traditional way that Western folk songs are organized. There's a bridge, there's a verse, there's a chorus. um so in that way, because it's a style of organizing music that people in the Western world have been aware of for 200 years, and that way it is probably accessible.
Is that something you don't like? Are you fighting that? Like, do you have to make it more accessible than you want, or do you?
Oh, no, no, no. I mean, half of the music that we're interested in is the most minimal grading, quote unquote, difficult music that has ever been recorded. And that's music that's genuinely meaningful for us and important to us, and music
Mhm.
that is a huge inspiration to us. But the other half of music that is interesting and important to us is, like OMD is one of my favorite bands of all time, and they're like one of the most, although half of their music is really experimental, but their pop songs are some of the greatest pop songs of all time. I really like Prince is one of my all-time number one favorites.
Hmm.
Uh, so I mentioned folk music. It's both of my uncle and my father were folk musicians. So I
Right.
mean, like Western folk music is a big part of my, particularly American folk music is a big part of my background.
Mhm.
So I mean, both loves are equal. They're never in conflict with each other, and we're our label. I don't know why they're so tolerant of us, but they let us do pretty much whatever we want. I think
Wow.
sometimes when we do something to, to them that seems weird, they're just like, okay,
That's like what we
whatever,
signed up
good luck.
for.
I guess, but so I mean, so we never feel any pressure from them ever to do things that are a little a little more straight ahead,
Wow.
or a little more song based. We feel very very free to, the record we did before this, Ignore Grief, was like the most experimental record we've ever done. There's not a single song on it. They're all pieces or
Yeah.
very very abstractly organized. And I kind of tried to talk our A&R guy, not out of releasing it, but I said, well, why don't we do a super limited, like thousand only, printing, like a really small printing. It's like, oh, no, 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 let's do a regular release. So I mean, which so
You're
they're
like,
they're
okay.
they're yeah, kind of. I mean, and it did a lot better than I expected it to. So I mean, he knows his job, and he made the right call. Thankfully, luckily, I don't know, we ended up with the right people. They're extraordinarily supportive. Polygonal Records, thank you.
I wonder if you think about like how disparate forms of art like inform one another, because it seems like for you that does inform your music.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know that I think about it necessarily, but I'm certainly extraordinarily open to it. And
Mm.
uh, in any aesthetic pursuit is an equally important inspiration to us.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And
Mhm.
uh, I think in some ways, almost because I spend all of 6 or 7 days a week deeply involved in concentrating on music. Sometimes it's almost easier to watch a movie or go to a museum or a gallery and ingest that without any sort of, you know,
Mm.
professional or analytical bias attached to it. It can almost be more of a pure inspiration, because a lot of times when I listen to a record, unless it's like classical music, which is I don't really have any. I mean, I'm a huge fan, but I'm not involved in that world in any way. The analytical part of my brain, it's almost impossible to not let that sort of creep in, and it can a lot of times get in the way of just being able to listen to something. But because I don't know anything about making movies, I don't want to know anything about making movies for this very reason. I just want to be able to enjoy it purely and be moved by it purely. And it's one of the reasons why I really particularly enjoy a lot of field recordings or a lot of indigenous musics, because in a trillion years I'm never going to understand that or have any real relation to it, so I can listen to it more with a pure ear.
Without like trying to, yeah, get your own
I
sort of
understand it or be judgmental
aesthetic.
about it, or just
Sure.
be like, oh, those jerks are ripping off this, or oh, that's so jive, they did this 30
Totally.
years ago, that I could not
Yeah.
be judgmental about it.
Right. Even if they are, you don't know.
Right. Yeah, I have no idea.
Hey, did you grow up like being a film buff, or was that like something you kind of acquired a taste for later in life?
In a funny way, I had not the best childhood in the world, but my dad was a musician
Mhm.
and in the music business, and they were both hippies, and so both of my parents were interested in art or deep, and my father in particular deeply involved in it. But one very positive thing that my mom and occasionally my godmother would do is I grew up in Los Angeles. And at that time, when I was growing up, there was a trillion movie theaters and a lot of art movie theaters, a lot of small ones. There's still a lot there, but there was like 7 times more. I mean, I lived in the suburbs, and in the suburbs, like every 3 blocks there was one.
Sure.
So we would just go to any of these small art theaters, not knowing what was playing. This is before the internet, so you could look it up and see the preview. And
Right.
we didn't do it a lot, but we did it enough that I began to, at a pretty relatively young age, realize that there was big Hollywood movies and that there were smaller art movies. And as I got older and more independent, I started doing this myself and realizing that, oh, this is something that you can deeply pursue. This is an entire world with a long history.
Mm.
So I guess from pretty early on, exploring what movies had to offer in a broad way was something that my mom made clear to me was worth pursuing.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, I love the Twin Peaks record is just I think it's brilliant. And it's so
Oh,
funny.
thanks.
It's funny because like it's like you're like, oh, there's like a lot of overlap in my personality that I like don't realize is like, is like a lot of other people share. So I'm guessing there's a lot of people who like Twin Peaks who also like Xiu Xiu. So,
David Lynch is one of, and that universe in particular is one of the biggest, absolutely biggest. Like we would not exist without David Lynch, and
mm,
particularly without Twin Peaks.
interesting. Wow, that's fascinating. That's an interesting statement.
I mean, just insofar as, well, I watched it. I was a kid, very, very young when it was on, but I watched it and did not understand. It was completely over my head. And then accidentally took my brother to see Firewalk with me because my brother's 6 years younger than me. He was really, really little. We didn't know. It was just kind of one of those a movie thing where it was, oh, there's a
Right.
movie. We were like, we were terrified. Had no idea. So it was burned into my mind as a very small child, this universe. And then about the time the Xiu Xiu was starting, I began, what on video watching Twin Peaks for the first time, and just we the person I started Xiu Xiu with, Corey McCulloch, we had been in a couple other bands together that we didn't put a lot of thought into them. They just sort of formed, and they were a little bit. I enjoyed being in those bands, and I learned a lot from them, but they weren't particularly focused. And when we started Xiu Xiu, we very much, like, we literally sat down and said, okay, when we want to do this, 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 and this, we're open to doing other stuff, but to start off,
Interesting.
we made literally wrote down a list. And kind of at that same time that we were thinking about this list, I was watching Twin Peaks, and it's the only, I cannot think of any other film, certainly no other TV show that, and I've said this a bunch of times about this, but just that's it's very, very strange, super creative, very, very funny.
Yeah.
It's kind of romantic. It's frightening. It deals with supernatural aspects. It's very, very open to supernatural aspects, and it is also at the same time a political statement on, kind of the underbelly of America.
Right.
And I thought, okay, this is okay. That's totally amazing that David Lynch can do all these things at the same time. Okay, we definitely want to try to do all of these things at the same time. Also, I mean,
Mm.
we're not as successful doing it as that, aesthetically or certainly publicly, but that as having a purview that is that broad and exists all at the same time we got from that TV show, and has been a goal for us since.
Did you like The Return?
My number one favorite thing he ever did. I love it
So
so
good,
much. I
right?
love it so much.
I know, I'm
It's a
obsessed
it's
too.
a point of major contention between me and my sister, because she really loves Twin Peaks, and she
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 didn't like
cannot
it.
deal. She's angry with me. She is
Oh,
mad at me that
wow.
I love it. And
Oh
my
my
brother has
God.
never seen it, and he's just starting to watch it this week. And I know that she's going to be mad that I told him that the reason that he has to watch it is so he can get to the third season.
So you can
It's
have,
going to be
right.
Thanksgiving is going to be really difficult this year.
I was watching your interview with Anthony Fantano from a couple years ago, and one of the like top comments is like Jamie's music, and then it's a skull, like a bunch of skull emojis, and then it's like Jamie talking about their music, and then it's like rainbows and flowers.
It's not unfair.
No, and I think it was like meant to be endearing, but I wondered if like if you ever feel like you're not sort of, if you haven't fit into, I mean, I'm sure I know the answer to this, but if you feel like you don't really fit into a box and you haven't throughout your career.
I mean, I don't want to say this in a self-aggrandizing way, but I'm a very weird person. I don't want to be weird. I think calling somebody weird is not a nice thing to say. People called me weird my whole life. They never meant like, oh, I mean it in a nice way. No one means it in a nice way. If they call you weird, they're shooing you away, that you're too much to deal with. So I know this about myself. I wish I wasn't. It's not fun operating in the world in a way that doesn't really fit. And again, I'm not trying to sound self-aggrandizing, but it's
Of
just
course.
I've since I was a kid, it's been made very apparent to me that this is how
Yeah.
people see me and who I am. I mean, at this point, I could give a fuck, but
Sure.
so no, I mean, it's beyond my control. Try as I might, it will never happen.
But it's
It makes life
obviously,
way easier, but it's I it's I've come to a certain terms with it.
yeah.
Yeah,
What
it'll never happen.
well, like, and then, but then having this, then like this devoted fan base, all these years later.
Our entire goal with making records is to try to make something that somebody can get something out of, because or that somebody can get something out of, excuse me, just because we've gotten so much out of you know thousands of records and millions of movies and trillions of books and infinity art shows. So we're trying to be a part of that cyclical thing that has been a real, and I don't mean this in an exaggerating way, a real salvation for us. And I mean, when I say us, I mean anyone who's ever been in the band. um and part of that is trying to make music that, I mean, Xiu Xiu is certainly not for everybody, but it is for very specific people, and generally for people who were, in one way or another, kind of on the edge of some aspect of life, internally or externally. So, I mean, that's the group of people that we are, and that is the group of people for whom we are trying to make records. Anyone, who's not a fascist is certainly invited, but um, I feel incredibly grateful to get to serve in the attempt of being part of that of that continuum.
I've read that there's like a pretty like there's a big or growing artist community in Berlin. I was curious if that kind of informed the move there, if it was financial.
Angela, my bandmate, and I have been roommates for years, and we were housemates in Los Angeles. And where Los Angeles is, we both grew up there, moved away, and came back in 2012. Excuse me. At the time we came back, it was kind of going through a really fabulous renaissance. It was the best that I think that in my entire life that city had ever been, and I had lived there for the majority of my life. It just seemed to anything cool that you think was happening, could be happening, seemed to be happening there at that time, and it was like that up until the pandemic, and it really got its ass royally kicked during the pandemic, and did not seem like it was going to be able to heal itself. It was just getting to be more and more depressing and more dangerous. Our neighbors made it abundantly clear that they did not want us to live there,
Wow.
to the point of like throwing eggs in our yards and like putting nails into our tires and stuff like that. It was not, they were not cool. So it just, all of those things at the same time, it seemed like, okay, we got to move. I love it. The houses at the time there were affordable, so we were able to get a very beautiful house. Um, and it was just between that and the rest of LA falling apart, and it's relatively close to LAX, so it's on a flight path, and that was really a lot more difficult to deal with than I thought it would be. And then there's an art group in Berlin called Cheap that we have done music for a bunch of times and been involved in performance art a lot, and they helped us through an arts organization here called Silent Green to get a residency here, which basically they paid for us to come over. They helped us out with visas. They gave us a place to live for the first 3 months. So all of this was happening at the same time that LA seemed to be a less and less livable place for us at the moment. We were like, okay, this it could not be easier for us to get out of here. And we have a connection to the city. Angela used to live here, and we do work here pretty regularly. So it seemed like it would be foolish to not take advantage of the opportunity.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And has it been a positive experience so far?
By and large,
Right, of
it
course.
was a bigger adjustment than I thought it would be. I thought because I'd been here a lot before, I'd spent a lot of
Okay.
time here, that I thought, okay, it'll be fine and everything will be totally great. The myth that Germans are super punctual and super organized or the stereotype is completely not true. It is almost surrealistically disorganized. Like it's impossible to get almost anything practical done. The
Wow.
postal service is awful. If you have a plumbing problem, good luck forever.
Wow.
Like there's nobody to help you with like a problem with your of any kind with your apartment. But the public transportation is totally amazing.
So yeah, it's
So
all
somehow,
trades.
like, I don't understand how can these super fundamental aspects of life be but these other super fundamental aspects of life be unbelievably efficient. Like
Yeah.
the grown up parts, it's much safer. I'm much, much, much less stressed out.
Yeah.
I don't have to have a car, which is great. If I have a major health problem, it's gonna be totally fine. Um, those things are great. The adult parts are great. It's a little boring. So, like the teenage parts are not as exciting. So I feel it was a wise thing to do. I do miss
Practical.
LA a lot. Yes, it was very
Mm.
practical.
Being bored, does that stifle your creativity at all?
It's funny you should say that. I've been struggling with that a little bit and wondering or just realizing that my external environment for a long time was a big point of inspiration, and I'm realizing that I just have to adjust things. That it's not there, or what I found exciting in life does not exist here. A lot of people think this is one of the most exciting cities in the world, and I'm super happy for them. But the things that I find exciting in life are not really here. So I am needing to. I don't feel like my creativity is stifled, but it is going through a period of needing to adjust, which is a good thing. But it is certainly posing a new challenge.
Mm. I was thinking about like how a lot of people have, I would say I don't have a super high tolerance for sort of like dissonant sounds and like experimental stuff. But I mean, I like you guys a lot. So, but I also think you do a really good job of like making it pleasing still. Um, but I do think there's something about like I said, like that show that I saw you at, it was like one of the most like transcendent shows I've been at.
Well, that's really nice.
Um, and I was curious for you, like when you realized that like that tension is something that like moved you of like not you didn't just want pleasing music.
I remember it really clearly, and there was
Mm.
one particular record, the record "Holdy Paws" by Deerhoof. They got us our first record deal on 5RC, which is part of Kill Rock Stars. Um, or they helped us. They gave our record to the label head and helped
Sure.
kind of create that relationship. That was one of the first records that I had heard that and it was before Xiu Xiu had started. That was
And you were still in LA.
no, I lived in San Jose at that time,
Okay, okay.
and they lived in San Francisco then. Um, that really very, very catchy melodies, but super wild, almost abstract drumming and really intense, uh, dissonant, scratchy, exploded guitars. But those two things happening and making a lot of sense together.
Mm.
I had heard that record, the band that I was in with Corey McCulloch before Xiu Xiu was called 10 on the Swear Jar, and we were trying to figure something out, and then we heard that record, and then we started introducing that stuff into that band, and the other people weren't into it, and we're like, okay, we need to start this own thing, and that is kind of what happened with Xiu Xiu. And we were listening to a lot of stuff, listening to a lot of modern classical and listening to a lot of noise records, while we were still listening to song based records, but didn't really know how to incorporate that stuff as much. But that record made it abundantly clear.
Mm.
And we never sounded anything like Deerhoof and approached it, and I think we approached it in a very different way. But the impetus to explore music in that way is entirely due to that record and that band.
That's so
And
fascinating.
Greg the drummer has been he's produced the drummer of that band. He's
Sure.
produced a bunch of our records and remains a really close friend and a confidant and mentor in a lot of ways.
I'm curious, when you think of album names, is it usually like a afterthought, or do you give it a lot of thought?
It's somewhere in the middle. Generally, it's just, this is going to make me sound like an incredible cornball, but a lot of my sort of aesthetic musical practice, already sounding like a cornball, is trying not to think very much and just trying to allow whatever the goddess of music to, beam into the present moment. And almost always the album titles that will just sort of appear, and we're like, oh, okay, that's the right album title. And in this case, considering this sort of ridiculousness of that album title, it was one that was just there. I do have a pretty large. I'm not an insane collector, but I do have a lot of collections. And one collection I have is of switchblades. And one of the switchblades in my collection, probably the nicest one, is certainly the biggest one, is the one that's the title of the record. It's difficult to put into words without, again, sounding like a cornball maniac. But there's not any literal reason why we chose it. Like, the switchblade was around. And it like, as a sort of talismanic item, it seems to work
It's
its
giving
way
off
into
some
the.
energy, right?
Yeah, and it's in no way that I can explain in English, but I can certainly very much feel, and Angela feels the same way. Angela's not my bandmate. That, like, this item is somehow part of the consciousness of this record. For us, it feels like a fact, but not one that we can really explain why. We don't want to argue with the universe and
With the
whatever
music
it is.
gods.
Whatever it is,
Right.
great. Yeah, exactly.